Joining us now are two campus reform correspondents. Michael Duke, he's a student at Fordham University who reported on the ground from multiple protests taking place in New York City, and also Alexander Richmond, a student from the University of Michigan who witnessed firsthand the anti-Israel movement growing there. Michael and Alexander, welcome to the show. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Michael, I want to start with you on campus at Fordham. Obviously, New York City kind of felt like ground zero for a lot of these protests. Have they piped down at all, or is it still thriving up there in NYC?
Yeah, well, I have to tell you, the inmates are still running the asylum at these New York City colleges and universities. My school in particular, it's Little Columbia, and it has been for quite some time since the protests erupted in early last spring. But to your point about how these protests are anti-Semitic and how they're anti-American, I cannot agree even more, especially since through the Leadership Institute campus reform, I reported extensively on how students at these protests have been viciously anti-Semitic, but it's because of the indoctrination that they've been administered by professors and faculty at higher educational institutions, to the point where at Columbia University, when I was on the ground reporting, I saw students who were American yelling at the NYPD, likening them to the KKK because they were sheep and administrators were told them to at these protests. They allowed them to at these protests. It's sickening to me.
Wow, remarkable. Alexander, I wanted to talk a little bit about that because there was an episode this week where Harvard faculty has condemned a House report that actually raised concerns about what went on in these campuses. And the idea that the faculty wants to repudiate a repudiation of anti-Semitism seems like not the right learning culture. How much do faculty contribute to this environment of anti-Israel, anti-American sentiments that we saw on the campuses?
Yeah, of course. Anti-Semitism is not happening in a vacuum on these campuses. Leftist professors are teaching students that in order to be considered smart or sophisticated, that they need to adopt this anti-Western ideology.
At the risk of sounding a little geriatric, back in my day, college campuses were places where you could have a counter viewpoint. It was kind of the point of college campuses, was to go to college, go to higher education, and be confronted with ideas that were different from those that you had held for the previous 18 years. But now it kind of seems like college campuses are really just a hive mind for liberalism. Is that the case?
You're absolutely correct. And unfortunately, today's college campuses and today's higher education system is forcing a radical leftist ideology onto the minds of young, impressionable students, of course, with the hopes of churning out the next generation of Democratic voters. The higher education system is not teaching students how to think. It's not teaching them critical thinking skills. It's teaching them what to think. And if you're a conservative on a college campus, you essentially have a target on your back. Conservatives face verbal abuse from their peers in the classroom, whether that's in the classroom or on social media. Conservatives also face lower grades from their professors and different treatment from their university administrations.
One of the people that we turn to every time a very important issue comes up with education, particularly higher education, we turn to our great friend, Nicholas Giordano. He is a campus reform higher education fellow and professor of political science at Suffolk Community College. It's always great to have him on. Nick, welcome. I want to ask, because I think you have really studied this issue a lot, what has the education department in Washington done to change the nature of learning, and why do we seem to be falling farther behind since the education department got more involved?
Well, it's because they don't focus on actual education. And what they do is they implement these federal guidelines that they advise schools to follow, and then they tie the grant funding to it to make sure that the schools do follow them. So take DEI, for instance. You know, at Campus Reform, we've done a lot of reporting when it comes to DEI funding coming out of the federal government, going to schools, pushing a narrative that forces victimhood and oppressors versus oppressed. It's a toxic ideology that seeks to divide Americans. And a lot of these schools run with it because they need the funding. So the idea that if you shut down the Department of Education is going to have a detrimental impact on the education system as a whole is fundamentally false.
We've been talking about the opportunity to slim down Washington, particularly get rid of the education department, maybe throw some block grants, get some efficiency and better local control of education. I think you have a pretty good idea that maybe a lot of these higher education institutions don't need the big budgets that they have either.
Yeah, it's complete waste in higher education, and the way forward for overall restoration of our values is to slim down college campuses. There's just too much money in higher education right now not being used productively, and a lot of that comes from the federal government too. So I am glad that so much is on the table for 2025 with defunding universities that have failed their students and failed their communities. The top 20 universities in this country have $1 billion in endowment money. They should be relying on that as they slim down their campuses and readjust their financial priorities, or even find financial priorities to be more efficient and to be better serving institutions.